The bell for the end of the school day may have rung, but the learning doesn't end there. This is your geography revision session. We're covering Year 8 Module 2, Changing Places. I'm Mr. S and I'll be your revision tutor. The Changing Places module looks at where people live. We're interested in why settlements have built up where they have and how and why they're changing over time. As always, we have 5 elements to look at, so let's start with settlements. We have 3 elements we're going to look at in this settlements point. We're going to look at what the settlement hierarchy is, what settlement factors are, and what settlement shapes are. Let's start off with the hierarchy. When we're describing the type of settlements that people live in, so that a settlement is a place where we have a population, a group of people living, we can describe them in terms of their type of settlement. And the hierarchy is showing the type of settlement, how many people live there, and how many of those types of settlements they are. So let's go through this in order. Our pyramid represents our settlement hierarchy. At the bottom of our pyramid, we have the widest, the largest section, and these are called hamlets. Now, hamlets are really small settlements. You might only have maybe 3 or 4 buildings, 3 or 4 homes in a hamlet. It's a really, really small place. And you'll more likely find these out in the countryside, in the rural areas. Generally, there'll be small farm buildings. Now, you'll notice the population there is going to be from about 11 to 100, but even 100 is going to be quite a large population for a hamlet. Next one is a village. Now, villages are slightly larger, and we're going to have a population of around 100 to 2,000 people living in a village. And again, these are going to be more common out in the countryside, but we're getting closer towards the town, and therefore the commute towards a larger population centre is going to be less. Next, we have a town. So, for example, Hebburn and Jarrow would be classified as towns, although they've all merged together. And we've got a population of between 2,000 and 100,000 people. So these are getting quite large now. And some towns can be incredibly large. And then we have cities. So these can be from 100,000 to 1 million people. And then at the top, we've got capital cities. These could also be big conurbations, is another word that we could use. And a conurbation is when we have loads of towns or cities that have all merged together. And therefore, Jarrow, Hebburn, all the way down to South Shields is one big conurbation of people all living in one big urban population. And that's a conurbation. It's loads of places that have merged together. Now, the other thing we need to think about in terms of the settlement hierarchy is that the further up our pyramid we go, the fewer, the less of these types of settlements that we actually get. Hamlets, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of hamlets around the UK. But we only have one capital city in the UK. We have one capital for every country of the UK as well. But even if we consider that, there are only 4 capitals in the UK. The same for villages. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of villages in England alone. But there's only going to be maybe 20, 30 major cities. So the further up the pyramid we go, the less type of each settlement we're going to find. Next, we have settlement factors. The factors are the reasons why these settlements have built in the first place. Let's consider South Shields. There'll have been a reason why, way back in history, the first settlers said this is a good place to set up our home. And for South Shields, that's going to be because it was close to the coast. It's on the mouth of the River Tyne, and therefore we've got the possibility for trade because we can trade with further up the river, or it could be because both the river and the sea are providing a source for food, fishing. So a port city. And the same could be said for all of the settlements around the UK. There will have been a reason why they built in the first place. And we've categorised these into 4 broad areas. Economy, so that's to do with money, climate, physical factors, and traditions. Let's start with the economy. Lots of places, including Newcastle and Gateshead, will have started because of some form of economy. Newcastle and Gateshead were built where the River Tyne was at its narrowest and slightly easier to cross, which meant it was easier to trade. And therefore you're going to have markets being built. It became a commercial hub. That's what these nodal point means here, where lots of different smaller settlements would have come to Newcastle or Gateshead to trade, and therefore it became a hub for everybody to congregate at. It could be because of the ports. Again, South Shields would be an example of that, as well as North Tyneside and even Newcastle itself in later life of it. It could be because of tradition. Now, Durham is a really good example of this. Durham is built on a meander, so a bend in the river. So it means it's protected on three sides from attack, and you only have to protect it from one side where you can actually get to on land. And that's why they built the castle and the cathedral on that meander, because it's easy to protect, which also links to other types of defence here. The river would also provide other sources of water supply. So the tradition, the higher up we are, tends to be the better, because it's easier to spot enemies coming from a distance. Physical factors also link in with this. So the local relief, so the local shape of the land will influence where people would live. A lot of settlements probably wouldn't have been built at the very bottom of a hill because it would be more likely to flood. You want good soils for growing crop, or you need a water supply. You want resources like wood to build and for fuel. And then we've got climate. Well, you don't want something that's really boggy ground, so really, really wet, because all your buildings are going to sink, or your crops aren't going to grow very well. You want shelter, so you don't want it to be too windy, so you don't want to be right on the top of the hill and being blustered away. You might want to be on the side of the hill, away from the wind. And all of these things are influencing where these settlements were built in the first place. Today, that settlement may no longer have that key factor that influenced why the settlement was first built, but it'll have changed, which we're going to look at later on, its reason for why it's so popular. And then finally we have settlement shapes. Depending on what its original factor was, often influences what shape the settlement would have taken. For example, dispersed, well, that's more likely to be out in the countryside and probably to do with farming, and it would have been more likely to be a hamlet because you don't have many buildings. So you can see here, you've got a couple of buildings all off in different places in random orders, and it would have suited farmers because they would have tended to certain fields in certain locations. We then have linear. These are buildings that are congregated or sorted along a road in a straight line. When they develop further, they may go down a second road, but they're still following a straight line pattern. And again, this is going to be more to do with things like villages and towns where there is one road in and one road out. And then we have nucleated. They're also called clustered settlements. And you can see here that there's no one single shape, but they are all grouped together. And a good example of this would be South Shields. There's the River Tyne and this is the coast, and it's grouped around one major centre, and it's all spread out from there. And again, you're going to see more town cities and the capitals looking like this because they're so big and they've clustered everybody in close together. Next, we're looking at changing places. So as was mentioned in the last slide, although a settlement would have been built in one location because of a very specific factor, those factors do change. And today, some of the places that we live are no longer what they were originally intended to be. Hebburn and Jarrow were once fishing villages, but there's not a lot of fishing that goes on there now. Now, the function of those villages has changed. Today, Hebburn, Jarrow, South Shields are more to do with residential. And that means that people are living there rather than working in those locations. So they're going to have lots of houses and they're probably going to have some strong community. Whereas in the past, they were more industrial. There would have been a lot of factories and a lot of jobs in the area. For Hebburn and Jarrow, it would have been shipbuilding and mining, and going way, way, way back, it would have been to do with the resources of the area, such as going out to fish as well. We can have tourism, so South Shields will be an example of this. It will get tourism, it's got beaches, it's got landmarks for people to visit. There may be a lot of services or administration in the area of that village, that town. Newcastle, for example, is going to have lots of administrative buildings. So it's got the main council buildings, it's got the local government buildings there. It's also got hospitals and some of the bigger schools. Or it could be to do with commercial, and again, Newcastle and Sunderland would be examples of this, where we've got lots of shops and restaurants, and that's the reason why people come to those locations. And therefore, settlements do change, and let's have a look at why they do. If we think about some villages are losing people to the city, and that's because of this thing called rural to urban migration. People are moving from the countryside into the city because in the countryside there isn't as many jobs, and the jobs that are available, there's not often a lot of money in them. So younger people move to the city to find more work. Well, that's going to reduce the population of that village, and therefore they're not going to be able to keep open all those shops that they once did. And then we start to see things changing. So where the local school once was, well, there's not as many children living there anymore, so they don't need that school, and it might be converted into a tea room. So people come for the day, visit a countryside, and stop off at an old school that's now been converted into tea, coffee, and cake. Old farm buildings might be converted into barn conversions for expensive homes. So these huge homes that are made out of old barns and afford a lot of money. And where people used to commute to work by walking down the street, well, the people have to move further for those jobs, so they're commuting more. So people travel by car more than they did in the past. And then you've got things like the local shops and post offices. Well, again, most people are probably going to travel to bigger supermarkets now than they used to because they've got more access to cars. And the village shops are probably going to have to close down. Now, urbanisation, as people move into the city because of rural-urban migration, urbanisation is the process of the amount of people living in the city getting bigger. So the proportion of people living in the city is increasing. And there are push and pull factors. Why do people want to move from the countryside to the city? The push factors are pushing people out of an area, and the pull factors are pulling people to a new area. So in the case of rural-urban migration, the push factors are the reasons why people don't want to stay in the small rural villages anymore. Whereas the pull factors are why do they want to go to the city. So a push factor might be there are no jobs or few jobs, or there's few leisure activities to do, or it takes a long time to get to work because the commute is long. Whereas the pull factors for the city are, well, there's a greater variety of jobs and more money to be had. There are more leisure activities, more shops, more restaurants to spend your leisure time. And it's easy to get to work because you can take the metro or you can get a bus and it only takes 20 minutes because all of those services are available within the city and they're not in the countryside. Next up, we have land use. Now, land use is how are humans using the physical landscape. We're going to concentrate on the cities for this. And you can see two models here. One's called the Burgess model and one's called the Hoyt model. Now these models are really old, but we still use them as an example of how cities were once structured and how they're starting to change. The centre of the city, this blue dot with the number 1, is the CBD, the Central Business District. That's the very centre of the city where you have all the major shops and you've probably got some really, really expensive land. It's really expensive to build there. So it's where you've got your shops, your offices, your banks and your restaurants. There won't be very many people living there because it's too expensive, and you've probably got a train station or a bus station there as well to get people in and out the city. The further away we get from the CBD, the less expensive the land becomes. So the inner city has the large factories and the industries, but as they're starting to decline, we're also starting to see more housing taking place here. And we have a lot of terraced housing, so that's the really cramped together houses that have long rows and have a yard but probably not a garden. And the reason for that is, well, it's very expensive land, so you want to cram as many buildings and as many people living in there as possible. So that's why they tend to be quite small. And they're small with no gardens because you're not going to give a big garden to people because you want to maximise the available land to cram as many houses in there as possible. Then we have the inner suburbs, number 3 on here. This is where we're starting to see a bit more availability of land for housing. So instead of having long rows of terraced housing, which is really small, we've now got semi-detached houses, which means two houses joined together. And you're more likely to have a small garden, and maybe even a garage. The streets are much wider here, and it's predominantly all residential. You're not really going to have many factories out in the inner suburbs. And then we have the outer suburbs. This is the edge of the city. We're almost in the countryside at this point. And these are large detached houses. One house on its own, big gardens, garage, and you've probably got a front garden and a back garden. So these big detached homes are also surrounded with probably large shopping centres, because the land on the edge of the city is much, much cheaper. So you can build big shopping centres like the Metro Centre on the edge of the city, much cheaper, and you can fit more shops in it because there's more land. And you're going to have some large open green space there as well, because we're right on the countryside. What's left is this sort of faded yellow one, and that's called the commuter zone. This is the area that people will come from the countryside into the city to work. And that might be quite big, or it might be quite small, depending on how big your city is. If it's a big, big city, you're going to attract more people from the countryside to come and work there than a smaller city, because there'll be more job opportunities there. The Hoyt model is slightly different. It would be very unusual to find a city that is perfectly arranged like this. And the Hoyt model is trying to show that actually these things might happen in zones, going from the city centre, the CBD, moving out in different zones, probably following roads that go from the CBD out of the city. So you can see the inner city is in a zone, so is the inner suburbs, close to the CBD as well in this case, as well as having these outer zones of more spaced out residential. In this case, 5 is not a commuter zone, but an area of really, really expensive housing, the really, really affluent housing. We've also got to consider how cities expand. Now, the centre of the city is really, really built up, and there's not really that much space for new buildings. You'd have to knock something down, and that's called brownfield, when the land has already been built on. And it's a really good idea to use brownfield to rebuild on, because it makes good use of waste land. So there'll be areas that have gone completely derelict, like this picture here. It's not used. It's an eyesore. So it's going to make the area look better. And there's already infrastructure around it, like access to roads, water, electricity, schools, and things like that. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense to actually build on these old bits of land. And because land's at a premium in a city, it's really going to help. There are problems with this though. You're in the city and it's already got a lot of buildings and a lot of people living there, so there's going to be an increase in traffic if you keep putting new houses or new buildings on it. There might be more infrastructure needed. You might need to widen the roads. You might need to put more bus stops in. You might need to ensure that there's a better connection to water and electricity. But it's also more expensive to build on brownfield sites, because not only are you going to build a new house or a new office block, you've got to knock down the old one as well. But the alternative is to build on what's called greenfield. And greenfield would be in this bit here, where we've got sector 4, which is the outer suburbs, into the commuter zone. Now, a lot of people don't like building on green belt land or greenfield land, because what you're actually doing is expanding the size of the city. So this area known as number 4 is going to become wider as more greenfield is built on. Now, people like it because there's no existing buildings to clear, so it's cheaper. There's more space, so if you're building houses, you're going to have really big gardens, bigger housing. But overall, it is going to be cheaper as well, because the area on the outside of the city is cheaper land. So it's easier to buy, to build on, but also it's cheaper for people to buy the houses that's being built. But the negatives, well, we're going to have to build more infrastructure. We need new roads because it's out in the countryside. We're going to have to cut down trees or drive the wildlife away from the area, because this was once countryside that we're building on. And it's going to impact on the peace and the tranquility of the countryside. It's making it more urban than it was before. Next are UK places. Now, I'm not going to say too much on this. You need to know some rivers, mountains, and major cities of the UK. But what we will consider are, what do we mean when we're talking about the UK, Great Britain and the British Isles? Because they're not all the same thing. Our country is called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which is abbreviated to United Kingdom or the UK. So the UK is made up of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So all of this island here and the northern section of this island here. That's the UK, that's our country. When we're talking about Great Britain, it's only this island, which includes England, Scotland and Wales. The British Isles isn't a country, it's a collection of islands. So it has no political, no legal basis that we're talking about. It's just used to describe a collection of islands. So it's basically everything you can see on this map, plus a bit that's been cut off and a few islands that you can't see because they're too small. It includes England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, which is the rest of this island here. But it also includes the Isle of Man, which is this here. It also includes the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey, which are down here but are too small to be represented on the map. Each of our countries that makes up the UK has a capital city. Cardiff is the capital of Wales, Edinburgh is the capital of Scotland, Belfast is the capital of Northern Ireland, London is the capital of England, and it's also the capital of our country, the UK. Finally, we're going to concentrate on how cities are different in LICs, low income countries. LICs have some of the biggest growth of urbanisation. So remember, that is the proportion of people living in cities increasing. They have a massive amount of rural to urban migration. So if we think of our push and pulls, the push in LICs is that there is a lack of employment opportunities in the countryside. And there is overpopulation and a lack of available crops. What this means is that there aren't the jobs available for everybody in the countryside because there's so many people and so few jobs. And again, just like in the richer countries, in poorer countries, the jobs that are available are very poorly paid. Most people that live in the countryside farm. And they don't farm to make money, they farm purely to feed themselves. This is called subsistence farming. And if you've got a lot of people living there and the land isn't particularly fertile to grow crops, then people are going to start to starve. And this is called famine. This is the push. This is what's moving people from the countryside into the city. But why do they want to go to the city in the first place? Well, that's the pull. There are better jobs, but there are more of them as well. There are more jobs available to take. This in turn would allow them to increase their standards of living, not only because they're making money, but because there's more services. The likelihood is there will not be schooling, there will not be healthcare available in the countryside, but you will be able to get these in the city if you can afford them. And there'll be more reliable access to food through shops. People who migrate to towns and cities tend to be the younger people as well, and more likely to be of childbearing age, and so that's going to increase the birth rate in the cities. Now, the problem is, when people go from the countryside to the city, they also think it's going to be better than it is. There's an expectation, and that reality is not the same. People that move to the city can't find themselves a house because they don't have the money, they don't have the skills for a really good job. So they have to take the jobs that are available, which again are still low paid. And therefore, what starts to happen is we start to see these shanty towns being built. These happen on the edge of the city where people come, they don't have a home, so they have to build their own. And you can see in this picture here, all of these shanty town houses are built out of scrap material. They don't have permission from the government, but the government can't really do anything anyway because there just isn't the money and the available land to actually build proper homes for everybody. These also won't have access to things like water or electricity or gas or sewage networks, and you can see all the rubbish that's built up. The quality of life in these shanty towns is very, very poor. Let's have a look at what some of these problems are. Well, we are going to have overcrowding. you can see just in the small space there are a lot of homes. Each of these is probably going to have more people than you think living in them as well. In some cases there can be up to 20-30 people living in a single home. You can imagine, because these don't have any building controls, they're just built out of any scrap material, they're also going to be prone to fires. And because all these buildings are built really close together, the fires will spread very quickly between them. That overpopulation, overcrowding, does mean that there's not going to be enough resources for everybody as well. Perhaps not enough food, availability of water. And what this can also have a knock on, if you've got 20 people living in a home, it's going to have a knock on in terms of things like disease. Because of the poor sanitation, the poor access to food, people are more likely to get disease. And because you're living really close to other people, you're more likely to spread those diseases to the people living with you as well. There'll be competition for jobs. While the better paying jobs will be very competitive, a lot of these people moving from the countryside won't have the education to take those jobs. And so the available jobs are what are called informal jobs, jobs that aren't on the books. You're not paying taxes, the government doesn't know about them. Examples of this might be selling stuff on street corners, in markets, doing illegal building work for people, a whole host of things that require very little in terms of education, but are more to do with just having available manpower. And these in turn will also be very competitive because we've got a lot of people who don't have a job wanting them. There'll be a lack of space and a lack of infrastructure. As more people come into the city, more shantytowns are being built. That's leading to less and less available space. And as those continue to increase, the access to services such as transport, education, electricity supplies is going to decrease over time as well as this population of these shantytowns gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, some cities have tried to counteract this. In Rio, Brazil, the government has tried a few different strategies to increase the quality of living, the quality of life inside the shantytowns. So there are 3 schemes that have been trialled. There's this one called Site and Service, and what this does is, although the people at the minute in these shantytowns aren't paying rent, they don't own the land, the government's saying, well, we'll rent you, or you can buy this piece of land from us, and we'll connect it to the essential services like water and electricity and help you get into transport into the city. And in that way, they can start to build a legal home and start to approve it. And they've even started to give them low interest loans. Now, there are loans, they are expected to pay them back, but it's one way they've tried to help. The second way is through self-help schemes. So this is giving the people the tools and the training to improve their shantytown homes. That would be taking this home, for example, giving them some tools, giving them a small loan so they can use proper materials to rebuild that home safely. And they would also be given the legal ownership, the legal right to be on that land. And then finally, they've also tried to stop people or try to encourage people to stay in the countryside instead of coming to the city. And this is called rural investment. They're trying to improve the quality of life and the opportunities such as jobs available in the rural areas to prevent people from wanting to go to the city, to prevent that rural to urban migration in the first place. So this involves investing in the rural areas to improve the conditions there, and that in turn is going to help the people in the city because it's going to take less on their resources. It's going to reduce the strain on the resources of that city. That's it for today, but don't forget to complete the home study questions to test yourself. Goodbye.